Hello, could you help me grow this channel? Subscribing is totally free. Just one click below this video is all it takes.
The thing about learning how much your life is worth to the people who raised you is that it rarely comes in one clean cinematic moment. No thunderclap, no screaming match, no slam doors. Sometimes it's delivered in a living room that still smells faintly of microwaved pot roast, with the TV on low in the background, and your mother folding laundry as she tells you, almost gently, that they just can't help you right now. Not because they don't care, of course. Not because they're heartless. It's just, things are tight. You understand, don't you? I was sitting on the couch, legs tucked under me the way I always had as a kid, holding a printout from my cardiologist's office. I'd rehearsed the speech on the way over, trying to hit the right tone. Calm, adult, not panicked, even though panic had been buzzing behind my ribs for weeks. I'd even printed out a chart, complete with billing codes and insurance breakdowns, like I thought that if I looked professional enough, they'd forget I was still the same little girl who colored quietly in the corner while Brendan melted down over getting the blue cup instead of the red one. "It's called supraventricular tachycardia," I said, placing the packet between us on the coffee table. "It's treatable, it's manageable, but the out-of-pocket cost for the ablation is just over 19 grand. And I'm not eligible for assistance through my job because technically it's not life-threatening until it is." I watched my dad's eyes skim the page and then glance at my mom. They exchanged a look, the kind of look married couples pass when the decision's already been made and the conversation is just a formality. My mom folded a hand towel, set it on the growing pile beside her, and sighed like she was the one who'd been told her heart was firing off electrical storms with no warning. "Monica, sweetheart," she said, with that same voice she used when someone died on her soap opera. "We love you, you know we do, but things are, well, they're a little tight right now." I waited for the rest, for the suggestion, the payment plan, the possibility, but nothing came. I blinked. "Tight," I repeated, like maybe I'd misheard. "You just redid the kitchen." "It was a necessary renovation," my father said, folding his arms. "The plumbing was shot. And Brendan said you helped him pay off his car." My mother nodded, a little too fast. "He was behind on payments. His job's been so stressful lately. You know how much anxiety he deals with. We didn't want him to lose transportation." Something snapped inside me then, not loudly, but with a quiet, sickening pop, like a wire pulled too tight finally giving way. I realized in that moment that this wasn't about money. It was about priority. And I wasn't it. I left the packet on the table. They didn't pick it up. That night, lying in my bed with my chest doing that fluttery, skipping thing it had started doing more often lately, I tried to justify it. Tried to be the good daughter who doesn't rock the boat. Tried to think, they're older, they're stressed. Maybe they really don't have it. But then I remembered the way my mom's eyes had lit up last Christmas when she mentioned that Brendan really needs a place to unwind. Somewhere quiet, somewhere with a view, somewhere he could heal. At the time, I thought it was just talk, a fantasy, a parent's way of trying to cushion a son's failure with dreams of cozy porches and fresh air. But now it sounded more like foreshadowing. I didn't ask again. Not even when my symptoms worsened. Not when I had to leave work early for the third time in a month because I couldn't stay upright without feeling like the floor was tipping sideways. I pulled what little I had from savings, applied for every medical grant I could find, and cut corners everywhere else. I stopped going out. I started skipping meals. I pretended I could make it work if I just believed hard enough. Weeks passed. I saw them once or twice, family dinners where Brendan talked about needing to unplug, about how hard it was to be him, with all the pressure he was under. I smiled. I nodded. I passed the potatoes. And when he asked if I was feeling any better, I said, "Sure." I was at their house one afternoon, picking up some old boxes from the garage, when I noticed something odd in the kitchen trash. It wasn't the kind of thing you'd expect to see if money was tight. It was a crumpled receipt from a real estate office. I wouldn't have thought much of it, except for the bolded line at the top. "Deposit, rental property, Gatlinburg, TN." My hands went cold. Gatlinburg, the place Mom had gushed about when she'd mentioned cabins and views and how nature can really soothe the soul. The deposit was for $15,000. I stood there for what felt like an hour, just staring at that number. I wasn't even angry yet, just hollow, like the part of me that still believed they were decent people had quietly gotten up and walked out the back door. I left without saying goodbye. 3 days later, Brendan posted a picture on Instagram. It was him standing in front of a log cabin, arms spread wide, grinning like a game show contestant. The caption read, "My new weekend sanctuary. Huge thanks to the parentals for making this dream real." Sanctuary. I stared at that word until the letters blurred. That night, my heart skipped so violently I nearly blacked out in the shower. I sat on the floor for a long time, head between my knees, trying not to pass out. And as I sat there, wet and shivering and alone, I thought about how my brother got a sanctuary while I got the floor. I didn't call them, I didn't confront them, not yet, because something in me had shifted, and I knew I'd never ask them for anything again. Not money, not time, not explanation. But what I would give them, eventually, was a memory, one they wouldn't be able to buy their way out of, not even from the prettiest cabin on the highest hill. The first thing you should know about my brother Brendan is that he was born into the world already framed as fragile. Not because he was sick, not because he was underdeveloped, not because life handed him any greater challenges than the rest of us, but because from the very beginning, he was treated like something delicate, like a blown glass ornament, one sharp word away from shattering. My mother used to say, with a half smile that always carried more pride than concern, that Brendan felt things deeper, that he was sensitive to the world, and maybe that would have meant something if it wasn't always used as an excuse for why he didn't have to deal with the consequences the rest of us did. When I spilled juice on the carpet, it was carelessness. When Brendan did it, it was because he was tired from all that school stress. When I cried at 9 because no one came to my birthday party, I was being dramatic. When Brendan sulked over losing a video game, we all tiptoed for hours. So when the cabin became real, when that little fantasy of mountain air and fire pits and winding porches with a view stopped being a wistful daydream and instead arrived fully formed, with custom shutters and a welcome mat that read Brendo's Retreat, I shouldn't have been surprised, but I was. And the worst part was that, somewhere in me, I still hoped I'd been wrong, that maybe that receipt I found was for something else, that maybe it was for a timeshare, or a partial investment, or a rental plan they were simply co-signing. But no, it was a gift. A clean, unconditional gift. No strings attached. No awkward repayment terms. Just a family's way of saying, "We believe you've earned this rest." He posted the full tour on Facebook a week after moving in. I watched it late at night, alone in my apartment, with the same feeling you get when you're reading about someone else's life and suddenly realize it's your own family in the background. His voice echoed through the video, cheerful and proud, narrating every detail. Here's the deck, here's the hot tub, here's the second bedroom for when the guys come up. He panned to the custom artwork Mom had picked out, the expensive espresso machine Dad had researched for weeks, the basket of organic teas with the note that read, "Because you deserve peace." I paused the video, rewound, read the note again. I deserved peace too, or maybe not. Maybe I had simply never been considered the kind of person who needed it. The next day I did what any wounded daughter would do. I showed up unannounced. They weren't surprised to see me. My mom hugged me like she always did, all perfume and politeness, and asked how I was holding up. My dad offered coffee. I declined both. I sat on the couch with that same old ache building in my chest, not from my condition this time, but from the tension of knowing I had to ask a question whose answer I already feared. "Did you buy him the cabin?" I asked calmly, without accusation, like I was asking about the weather. My mother blinked, taken aback by the bluntness, but recovered quickly, smoothing her hair and nodding slowly as if to prepare herself for a misunderstood backlash. "We helped him, yes," she said carefully. "He's been going through so much lately. And with his lease ending and all the pressure at work, we just thought, why not give him a chance to breathe?" I waited for the part where they acknowledged the hypocrisy. The part where someone said, "We know it wasn't fair, Monica, but it didn't come." My father chimed in, offering some justification about property values and real estate being a smart investment and how Brendan really needed something to anchor him. Anchor him. I was barely staying afloat, and they were worried about giving Brendan something to hold him steady. "You told me money was tight," I said, my voice quieter now, not because I was afraid, but because yelling would have made it too easy for them to dismiss me as emotional. "It was tight at the time," my mother said, her eyes darting to my father as if to confirm the narrative. "But your brother's situation, it felt urgent." Urgent. That word sat like lead in my stomach. My condition had been urgent. My body was literally short-circuiting. My heart had been skipping like a broken metronome. I'd handed them medical documentation, sat across from them with visible tremors, and they decided that a 32-year-old man's discomfort about urban noise was more pressing. I didn't say another word that day. I left before the coffee finished brewing, but I watched Brendan's posts. Every single one. He updated frequently, pictures of bonfires with captioned thoughts about healing, shots of his dog curled up on the porch, rants about city people who didn't get the vibe of nature and how they were ruining the peacefulness. I noticed something strange, though. The same people kept popping up in the background. Different groups, different weekends, and then it clicked. Brendan wasn't just living in the cabin, he was renting it out. I opened Airbnb, typed in Gatlinburg, scrolled until I found the listing. There it was. Modern mountain retreat, peaceful views, hot tub, fast Wi-Fi. The photos were his, the mugs were Mom's, the espresso machine was featured in the top 5 amenities. The reviews were glowing. One guest even thanked Brendan and his family for such a beautiful property. He was making money. On top of everything else, he was monetizing the gift they gave him out of pity. My hands shook. I stared at that page until the screen blurred. Not because I was jealous, but because it was the final confirmation that I had been erased. Not dismissed, not forgotten, erased. My crisis had been a footnote, a distraction, a moment of discomfort quickly moved past. Brendan's stress, that was a cause. A rallying cry, a full-blown movement that earned him equity, decor, and passive income. I didn't cry, I didn't scream. Instead, I started documenting. I screenshotted the listing, saved the reviews, cross-referenced zoning regulations, learned more about short-term rental violations in Tennessee than I ever thought I'd need to know. Not because I planned to report him immediately. No, I wanted to wait. I wanted it to sting. I wanted it to feel earned. The same way my silence had been. The same way my pain had been ignored. The worst betrayals I learned aren't loud. They're quiet, practical, wrapped in logic, spoken through smiles, and when I finally made my move, it wouldn't be out of vengeance. It would be something colder, something sharper. Justice disguised as indifference. I wasn't planning revenge. I was just preparing for the moment they'd finally remember I existed. And when they did, it would already be too late. There's a strange clarity that sets in when you finally stop hoping the people who hurt you will ever apologize. It's not relief, not really. It's more like a quiet agreement between your mind and your body that you're done wasting energy on what won't come. You stop spinning scenarios where they realize what they've done and fall over themselves with remorse. You stop replaying conversations in your head, editing your own words as if you could have said it better, softer, stronger, clearer. Instead, you start making plans. Not emotional ones, not petty ones, just clean, surgical plans to cut out the part of your life that's been infected with disappointment and delusion for far too long. After I found the Airbnb listing and let the shock settle into something denser, something colder, I realized I had to save myself because no one else was going to. I wasn't someone's emergency. I wasn't even someone's inconvenience. I was a passing sentence in their narrative and, oh, she's dealing with something, before the conversation swung back to Brendan's newest retreat playlist, or the strain he was under from running a side hustle while also managing his full-time marketing job. I needed the surgery, not in some distant optional kind of way, not in a wait-and-see kind of way. I needed it soon, or I'd eventually be one of those headlines that make people whisper, "She was so young and so quiet." The last cardiology appointment I attended confirmed what I already suspected. My condition was worsening. The arrhythmias were increasing, and while it wasn't immediately fatal, the risk of a severe cardiac event was growing by the week. I had already passed out once on the subway, though I told everyone I was just overheated. Another time, I'd nearly fallen down the stairs at work when my heart kicked into a rhythm so chaotic it felt like a drumline was practicing inside my ribcage. The paperwork from the doctor was clinical, detached, factual, but what it meant was simple. Fix this soon or risk losing your life over something fixable. So I took what was left in my savings, barely enough to cover the cost of a used couch these days, and I called Amanda. Amanda and I had gone to college together back when I thought that hard work and being agreeable would eventually pay off. She was 2 years older, fearless in a way that made me feel like I was watching a movie character instead of a real person. While I was quietly excelling in every class and biting my tongue every time someone took credit for my work, Amanda was burning down group projects with emails that ended careers and professors who dared to grade her unfairly. We weren't close friends then, more like neighboring planets, but she'd always remembered me as the one who never spoke but always had the answers. When I called her, voice steady but barely above a whisper, she didn't hesitate. She didn't ask me why I hadn't reached out sooner. She didn't scold me for letting it get this far. She just listened. And then she connected me with a nonprofit she worked with on pro bono cases, an organization that helped cover emergency medical costs for women under 40 who were uninsured or underinsured and had no family support. Their board liked stories like mine, not because it was heartwarming, but because it was exactly the kind of quiet injustice that most people like to pretend didn't exist. Within 2 weeks, the paperwork was complete, a partial grant came through. A private hospital in Richmond agreed to do the procedure at a reduced rate. I packed a small bag, left a note at work that I was taking personal leave, and got on a bus. I didn't tell my parents. I didn't tell Brendan. I didn't even post a vague status on social media. I simply disappeared from their world the same way they had disappeared from mine. The surgery was uneventful, as these things go. Successful, clean. The recovery room was cold and smelled like antiseptic, and I remember staring at the ceiling for what felt like hours, wondering if this was the moment where things would feel different. They didn't, not right away. There was no surge of power, no emotional catharsis, just soreness, exhaustion, relief that was too tired to celebrate. Amanda picked me up the next morning. She brought soup, one of those oversized scarves that doubled as a blanket, and the kind of silence that respected my silence. We stayed in a small motel outside the city for a few days while I recovered, ordering takeout and watching whatever true crime docuseries was playing in the background. It was the first time in months I felt seen, not pitied, not dismissed, just accounted for. Once I could walk without dizziness, I went home. No one had noticed I was gone. There were no missed calls, no texts, no messages asking where I was or how I was doing. But Brendan had posted new photos. This time, the cabin had fairy lights. There was a caption about manifesting peace and how the mountains had helped him reconnect with his purpose. My fingers hovered over the keyboard. I wasn't going to message him. I wasn't going to rage. But I needed to say something, so I did what I knew they'd hate most. I told the truth. I called the house line, knowing full well that my mother still checked the messages every evening with the same compulsive nostalgia she applied to labeling Christmas decorations and organizing old cookbooks. My voice was calm, almost detached, as I spoke into the machine. "Hi, Mom. Hi, Dad. Just wanted to let you know I had the surgery. I'm doing okay. Didn't tell you because, well, didn't seem like you were in the loop lately. Oh, and I came across Brendan's rental page for the cabin. Beautiful photos. Real cozy. You might want to take a look at the zoning laws for that area, though. I hear they're cracking down hard on short-term listings. Anyway, Take care. I hung up and turned off my phone. I wasn't angry, not anymore. Anger implies you still care, still expect something from them, still believe they can do better. What I felt now was something colder, more precise, and far more dangerous. I had been cast aside, but I was still here, still standing. And now, I was no longer playing defense. They had gifted Brendan a house built on silence. I was about to show them what happens when silence finally speaks. The thing that struck me most, in the days following that voicemail, wasn't their silence, which by then had become as familiar and hollow as the ticking of a cheap wall clock in a waiting room, but the way they eventually did respond, not with humility or shame or even the decency of a question, but with something far more predictable, something I should have expected from people who never saw their own reflection clearly, unless it was flattered back to them. Outrage, carefully disguised as disappointment, painted over with the dull brush of wounded pride. It didn't come immediately. There was a pause, as if they needed time to decide whether this slight was real enough to merit a response. And then it arrived all at once, first through a curt text from my mother asking, "Was that message really necessary?" Followed by a full-blown phone call from my father, his voice thick with the kind of brittle authority that once might have made me flinch, but now only reminded me how small his power truly was. "What exactly do you think you're doing, Monica?" he began, not with concern or curiosity, but with accusation already loaded into the tone, as if he'd just been waiting for me to stumble out of the role they'd written for me and finally given them a reason to call me something other than ungrateful. I didn't flinch. I didn't rush to defend myself. I simply told him, in the same even voice I'd used to tell Amanda I needed help, that I'd had the surgery, it went well, and no, I hadn't informed them because I didn't feel like they'd earned the right to know. I could almost hear the air leave his lungs, not in shock, but in the way someone sighs when they realize a minor inconvenience is about to become a persistent problem. My mother got on the line next, her voice trembling in that rehearsed way that always made it sound like she'd just walked out of a tearjerker movie and wanted someone to ask her if she was okay. She said things like, "We've always loved you," and "You never gave us a chance to explain," as though love could be retroactively applied like a store credit. And explanations were something I had failed to request, instead of something they deliberately withheld until it became inconvenient to deny. And when I didn't respond, when I let that silence stretch out just long enough to remind them I wasn't going to fill it with apologies or soften it with kindness, she finally dropped the pretense. "You're being vindictive," she said, with that sharpness she usually reserved for the rare occasions when Brendan actually faced a consequence. This isn't how family treats each other. And that, those 7 words, soaked in hypocrisy and stripped of irony, was when I realized they would never understand. Not really. Because in their world, loyalty only flowed one way, and the ones who got the least were always expected to give the most. I wasn't supposed to be angry. I wasn't even supposed to be hurt. I was supposed to be grateful that they'd done anything at all, even if that anything had been a warm meal and a pat on the head, while they funneled money, attention, and emotional support into my brother like he was the one holding the family together, when in truth, he was the reason it had always been cracked. I let them talk, let them fill the space with justifications, with little rewrites of history, with anecdotes about how hard parenting is, and how no one gets it right, and how deep down, we were all just trying our best. And when it was clear they'd run out of steam, when the air around them had grown thin from too many words doing too little work, I simply said, "This is the last time I'm explaining anything," and hung up. I expected the fallout to be quiet, and it was for a while, until Brendan, golden child turned entrepreneurial martyr, decided to wade into the mess like he'd been personally betrayed. He called me 3 times in one day, left increasingly agitated voicemails, each one a masterclass in passive aggression and thinly veiled guilt-tripping. He said things like, "You could have come to me, and why would you want to ruin something good just because you're angry?" As if the fact that his Airbnb listing got flagged for violation, then fined by the county, was somehow my fault for not keeping quiet. The truth is, I never reported him directly. I simply submitted a copy of his public listing with screenshots of guest turnover and calendar activity to the appropriate office with a note that read, "Is this permitted under current guidelines?" I let the system do the rest. It wasn't revenge, it was a correction, but to them, it was an act of war. My mother left a voicemail 2 days later, her tone brittle and rehearsed, saying that they were worried about my state of mind, that it was unlike me to lash out like this, and that they were still willing to talk if I was ready to stop being spiteful. I didn't respond, not because I didn't have anything to say, but because I finally understood that no amount of words would ever reach people who only hear what flatters their version of events. Let them stew in their confusion. Let them build entire conversations in their heads, where I'm the villain and Brendan is the wounded hero, and they're the well-meaning parents caught in the crossfire of their daughter's bitterness. I didn't need to fix that story. I just needed to stop starring in it. And so I did. I poured all that energy, the kind that used to keep me awake at night, writing imaginary letters I'd never send, into something useful. I applied for a remote consulting job Amanda helped me land, one that paid better and respected boundaries. I bought myself a secondhand car with the grant money that had been left over after surgery and drove to places I used to only see in other people's vacation photos. I took my time. I breathed deeper. I didn't chase peace. I just stopped running from silence. One afternoon, standing at a scenic overlook 2 hours north of the city, I got another text from my mother. Just 5 words. "We need to talk, please." I stared at it for a long time, thumb hovering over the screen. Then I locked my phone, slid it into my pocket, and turned toward the edge of the overlook, where the mountains stretched out in layers of blue and shadow, and the wind made no demands, no excuses, no threats of abandonment masquerading as disappointment. They had called me vindictive, but I wasn't vindictive. I was finished. There's a certain kind of grief that doesn't arrive with a funeral or a headline, or a definitive goodbye, a quieter, more insidious loss that creeps in over time. Until one day you wake up and realize that the people you thought were your foundation were really just scaffolding, temporary and conditional, only present while you were still convenient to support. It took me longer than it should have to accept that my family wasn't broken in some dramatic, explosive way that could be fixed with a long talk and some tears, and maybe a reconciliation dinner where we all said things we should have said years ago. No, my family was perfectly functional for Brendan. It worked exactly as it was designed to, a well-oiled machine of selective empathy and resource distribution, where the golden child's pain was met with action, and everyone else's was gently redirected into silence, guilt, or shame. After the last round of messages, after the zoning fines were enforced, and Brendan's rental was shut down, temporarily, he claimed, though the tone in his voice said otherwise, I didn't speak to any of them for weeks. Not because I was staging some dramatic protest or waiting for them to grovel, but because I had finally come to understand that they weren't going to change. They weren't going to wake up one morning with new memories or new values or a sudden revelation that maybe, just maybe, they'd failed me in a way that couldn't be swept under the rug with a call and a casserole. They were going to remain exactly who they were. And if I wanted peace, real peace, the kind that isn't dependent on anyone else's behavior, I would have to stop expecting anything different. So I built a life without them. It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't cinematic. It was just quiet. I moved to a smaller city where no one knew my last name. I took the remote job and filled my days with work that didn't ask me to prove my worth beyond delivering results. I joined a hiking group, not because I liked hiking at first, but because I liked the idea of moving forward with people who didn't know anything about who I used to be. I started learning how to cook the things I used to pretend I didn't like, because my mother always made them taste like obligation. I stopped checking Brendan's social media. I deleted my old accounts. I bought a cheap but sturdy phone with a number I gave only to people I wanted in my life, and I let the old number stay active only because I wasn't quite ready to let go of the final thread. Not yet. The voicemails kept coming, not daily, not even weekly, but often enough to remind me that I still occupied space in their minds. Not as a person, necessarily, but as a loose end they hadn't managed to tie up. My mother's tone shifted from apologetic to passive-aggressive to performatively cheerful, depending on the day. My father rarely spoke, but I could hear him in the background, coughing, adjusting things, existing nearby like a ghost she couldn't banish from the kitchen. Brendan sent one long email, a meandering, self-serving novella in which he acknowledged tensions, offered no apologies, and made it clear that he was open to rebuilding the relationship if I was willing to move past what happened. I read it once, closed it, and left it in drafts where it still sits, unread and unanswered, a monument to the kind of false peace only narcissists believe in. And then, on an unremarkable Thursday morning, I received a letter in a plain envelope with no return address, postmarked from my hometown. I knew it was from them before I even opened it. Inside was a copy of their will, handwritten, no lawyer, no legal jargon, just a note in my mother's handwriting saying they wanted to make things right and restore balance, and that they had decided to include me equally. I laughed. Not bitterly, not angrily, just softly, the way you do when someone finally gives you something you stopped needing a long time ago. I didn't keep it. I didn't scan it, or file it, or tuck it away for a future where I might need it. I burned it. I didn't do it with ceremony or drama. Just a match and a metal bowl on the balcony, watching the pages curl and blacken, the ink dissolving into ash. It felt less like revenge and more like the final sweep of a broom through a room I no longer intended to live in. These days, when people ask me about my family, I say as little as possible. Not because I'm hiding anything, but because there's nothing left to say that hasn't already been felt, lived, and let go of. I don't explain. I don't justify. I don't unpack it for strangers or soften it for their comfort. Some silences are not wounds. Some silences are boundaries. Sometimes I walk past cabins, the real kind, the kind tourists rent for a weekend and never think about again, and I wonder if Brendan's place ever sold. Sometimes I type the address into Zillow just to see if it's still listed. It usually is. Price dropped. Again, I don't check out of spite. I check because it reminds me that everything people build on shaky foundations eventually cracks. The facade peels, the beams buckle, the view gets old. And no amount of fairy lights or weekend vibes can disguise the fact that the house was never really built for comfort. It was built for appearances. I think about calling sometimes, especially around the holidays or when I hear a song that reminds me of simpler days before I understood the math of love in our house. I think about dialing the number and seeing who picks up, but I never do. Because deep down, I know they'd pick up with voices dripping in nostalgia, with carefully chosen words designed to pull me back into the fold, into the quiet, unspoken contract that says, "We'll love you as long as you don't make us look at ourselves too closely," and I can't do that anymore. So when the phone rings now, when that old number flashes across my screen, I don't decline. I don't block. I just let it ring. I let it echo into the air, unanswered. Because sometimes silence is not cruelty. Sometimes silence is survival.